You have to understand something most people learn far too late. When you are dealing with a narcissistic woman, your instinct to explain yourself is not a strength. It is a vulnerability being exploited in real time. You believe you are clarifying, resolving, bringing truth into the conversation. But she is not listening for truth. She is listening for leverage. Every sentence you offer becomes material. Every justification becomes a thread she can pull, twist, and reshape. What you see as communication, she experiences as opportunity. And so the dynamic shifts without you even noticing. You are no longer expressing yourself, you are defending yourself. And once you are in a defensive position, you have already surrendered the frame. This is why the conversations feel endless. You explain once, then again, then with more detail, more emotion, more urgency, believing that clarity will finally break through. But clarity is not the goal. Control is. The discussion does not move forward because it was never meant to. It circles, tightens, repeats. And with every loop, you become more invested, more drained, more entangled. There is also something deeper happening beneath the surface. When you over-explain, you unconsciously signal that your reality requires her validation, that your thoughts must be accepted by her in order to stand. And that is the moment the balance of power quietly flips. Because now, she is not just part of the conversation. She is the judge of it. To step out of this pattern requires a psychological shift. You must stop assuming that understanding is mutual. It is not. And once you see that clearly, the urge to explain begins to dissolve. Not because you have nothing to say, but because you finally recognize that saying more will cost you more. The truth is simple but difficult to accept. The more you explain yourself to someone committed to misunderstanding you, the less of yourself you keep. Once you begin to see that explanation itself is a trap, another realization follows, perhaps even more unsettling. What you are facing is not confusion, but distortion. The narcissistic mind does not merely misunderstand logic. It reorganizes it to serve its own psychological needs. And this is where most people lose their footing, because they continue to assume they are engaged in a rational exchange. You present a clear point, measured, calm, even precise. And yet, moments later, that same point is reflected back to you in a completely altered form, subtly twisted, stripped of its original meaning, or exaggerated to the point of absurdity. It leaves you disoriented. You begin to question not just the conversation, but your own clarity. Maybe I didn't say it right. Maybe I need to explain it better. And so you try again. But this is the mechanism. It is not that your logic failed. It is that logic was never the playing field to begin with. What appears as misunderstanding is often a strategic reframing. By bending your words, she shifts the emotional tone, redirects the focus, and places you back into a position where you must defend, clarify, and justify. And again, without realizing it, you are pulled deeper into a structure designed to keep you reactive. Notice how the conversation rarely resolves. It mutates. It evolves into something else entirely. The original point disappears, replaced by side arguments, emotional triggers, and subtle accusations. You find yourself arguing about things you never intended to discuss. This is not accidental. It is psychological redirection. And here lies the critical insight. When truth is not the objective, truth has no power in the exchange. You can be right and still lose, because the outcome was never tied to correctness, but to control. The moment you understand this, something shifts internally. You stop trying to win through logic, because you finally recognize that you were never in a debate. You were in a dynamic. And dynamics are not won by better arguments, but by refusing to participate in the distortion. If you remember nothing else, remember this. When someone bends reality to control you, clarity will not free you, distance will. When you begin to withdraw from explanation and recognize the distortion at play, you are left with a question that feels almost unnatural at first. If words no longer serve you, then what does? And the answer, though simple, requires a level of discipline most people are not accustomed to. Silence, not passive silence, not avoidance rooted in fear, but deliberate, controlled, non engagement, because what you are dealing with is a system that depends on reaction, emotional responses, whether anger, frustration, or even the need to be understood, are the very signals that sustain the dynamic. They provide feedback, confirmation, and most importantly, access. When you remove that response, something shifts. The rhythm breaks, the expected pattern collapses. Where there was once a predictable cycle, trigger, reaction, escalation, there is now interruption, and interruption creates uncertainty. Silence, in this sense, is not empty. It is highly communicative. It signals that you are no longer participating in the exchange on those terms. It denies the other person the emotional material they rely on to maintain influence. And perhaps most importantly, it recenters you. Instead of being pulled outward into constant reaction, your attention returns inward, where clarity and control actually reside. Of course, this is often met with increased pressure. The attempts to provoke may intensify. There may be sharper words, stronger accusations, more calculated efforts to draw you back in. This is not a sign that silence is failing. It is a sign that it is working. The system is attempting to restore itself. And this is where most people falter. They interpret that pressure as a cue to respond, to correct, to re-engage. But if you hold your position, calm, observant, unaffected, the dynamic begins to lose its grip, not all at once, but steadily, because in the absence of reaction, control has nothing to attach itself to. And that is the paradox you must understand. The less you say in these moments, the more you reclaim. As silence begins to interrupt the pattern, a deeper layer of mastery is required, one that is far less visible, yet far more decisive. It is not enough to simply withhold words. You must begin to withdraw your emotional investment. Because even in silence, if you are internally reacting, replaying the conversation, feeling anger, needing resolution, the dynamic still has a hold on you. A narcissistic personality does not engage only through words. It engages through emotional hooks, guilt, confusion, self-doubt, the need to be seen as fair, reasonable, or good. These are the entry points. And if you are not aware of them, you will find yourself pulled back in, not through argument, but through feeling. This is why emotional detachment is not coldness. It is clarity. It is the ability to observe what is happening without immediately identifying with it. You begin to see the patterns instead of being consumed by them. The accusations no longer define you. The distortions no longer destabilize you. They become predictable, almost mechanical in nature. And in that awareness, something shifts. You are no longer reacting from instinct, but responding, if at all, from intention. There is space between what is said and how you choose to process it. And in that space lies your autonomy. This does not mean you feel nothing. It means your feelings are no longer being dictated by someone else's behavior. You are not suppressing emotion. You are reclaiming authority over it. And that distinction is critical because suppression creates tension, but detachment creates freedom. When you reach this point, you become increasingly difficult to manipulate, not because you are resisting harder, but because there is simply less to manipulate. The usual tactics, provocation, guilt, emotional confusion, begin to lose their effectiveness. They no longer find a place to land. And this is where real power begins to emerge, not in controlling the other person, but in no longer being controlled by the emotional currents they create. Because ultimately, the strongest position you can hold is this: to feel without being moved, to see without being pulled, and to remain grounded in a reality that no one else can rewrite. As you begin to detach emotionally, another shift becomes not only possible, but necessary. The way you understand and implement boundaries. Most people approach boundaries as something to be explained, negotiated, or justified. They believe that if they can articulate their limits clearly enough, the other person will eventually understand and respect them. But within this dynamic, that assumption becomes a liability. Because the moment you start explaining your boundaries, you are no longer enforcing them. You are presenting them for approval. And approval, in this context, is precisely what you cannot afford to seek. A boundary is not a statement, it is a decision. It is not something you argue for, it is something you embody through behavior. The more you attempt to rationalize it, the more you invite it to be questioned, challenged, or subtly undermined. What could have been a simple line becomes a prolonged discussion. And in that discussion, your position weakens. This is why the most effective boundaries are often the least visible in language, but the most consistent in action. You do not announce them repeatedly. You do not defend them under pressure. You express them once, if necessary, and then you let your behavior carry the message forward. You reduce access. You disengage from certain conversations. You remove yourself from environments that repeatedly violate your sense of stability. At first, this can feel uncomfortable. There is a natural urge to explain, to soften the impact, to make sure you are not misunderstood. But that urge again pulls you back into the same pattern, seeking validation for decisions that require none. Over time, however, something becomes clear. When your actions remain consistent, the need for explanation dissolves. The other person may not agree, may not even understand, but they will recognize the shift because consistency communicates something words cannot: finality. And this is where your authority quietly establishes itself, not through force, not through argument, but through alignment between what you say and what you do. Because in the end, a boundary that needs constant explanation is not a boundary, it is a request. Once you have mastered silence, detachment, and boundaries, the final shift is both subtle and transformative. It is the realization that the ultimate power move is not about controlling her behavior. It is about reclaiming yourself. For too long, your energy, your attention, and even your identity may have been pulled outward, orbiting the gravitational field of someone else's manipulations. The game she plays is designed to make you forget your own center. But the moment you redirect that focus inward, the dynamic flips in ways that no argument or confrontation could achieve. This is not a superficial withdrawal or an act of avoidance. It is a conscious turning toward growth, discipline, and personal integrity. Every hour you invest in your clarity, every decision to honor your values over her expectations, strengthens your position far more effectively than any confrontation ever could. She may notice your absence, or she may not, but her power relies on the pretense of your dependence. Remove that, and the leverage evaporates. Consider this: when someone no longer occupies the center of your attention, when your validation is no longer available to them, They are forced to confront a reality they cannot control. Your absence becomes a mirror, reflecting what they cannot dominate. And in that reflection lies a subtle yet profound shift. You are no longer reacting to her actions. You are building silently, deliberately, the life and mindset that she cannot influence. This is why the focus must always return to yourself. Every habit you cultivate, every boundary you enforce, every choice you make in alignment with your principles fortifies your inner power. You are no longer a player in her game because you have created a game of your own, one in which you define the rules, the pace, and the outcome. And here is the truth that changes everything. The real victory is never in making her recognize her misdeeds. It is in outgrowing the environment where they could ever affect you. When you stop being available as a target, you stop being vulnerable. So remember this: the moment you stop revolving around her orbit, you reclaim your gravity. And that is the point where true power begins.